Orders of the day. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Item 1, the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Bill, second reading.
Minister for Home Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, point of order, please.
Mr. Leong. Your turn to speak will come up soon.
I understand that, Speaker. I'm proposing an amendment to the question.
Mr. Leong, you can raise that when your turn comes. Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, sir. I understand that the Minister's speech will exceed 40 minutes. So, Mr. Speaker, may I seek your consent and the general assent of members present to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 to remove the time limit in respect of Minister Shanumgam's speeches.
I give my consent. Does the Leader of the House have the general assent of the honourable members present to so move? Leader, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 in respect of Minister Shanumgam's speeches.
Question is, as moved by the Leader of the House, as many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Minister.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. This bill covers two aspects dealing with online hostile information campaigns, call them HICs, conducted by foreign parties. I'll refer to that as the HIC part. And the second part, dealing with foreign interference through local proxies. The second part, I'll refer to it as the politically significant persons, or PSP part. The second part is about slightly more than half of this bill. And there is existing law, the Political Donations Act, PDA, which we have ported over. We have ported over the existing PDA and updated it. MPs will be familiar with the PDA. So it is a PDA which has been brought into the PSP part of the bill with updating. I will set out the reasons for this bill, deal with some of the concerns that have been raised, deal with the proposed amendments by the Workers' Party. My colleagues Desmond and Faisal will take the members through the detailed provisions of the bill. First, on the PSP part of the bill, the philosophy is that our politics, it's for Singaporeans to deal with. We can argue, disagree, but ultimately it is for us to decide. If I can quote what the former FBI Director James Comey told the House Intelligence Committee in March of 2017, and I quote, "One of the things we radiate to the world is the importance of our wonderful, often messy, but free and fair democratic system and the elections that undergird it. And so, when there is something by a foreign nation state to mess with that, to destroy that, to corrupt that, it is very, very serious and threatens what is America, the very idea of America." We don't put it in the same grandiose terms, but Singapore is important for us. And we take the very same approach. And we say it is not for the Americans to tell us what to do, as they have tried. And it's not for anyone else to tell us what to do either. And this was expressed in 1973 in the President's speech and expressed in law through the PDA. sets out the rules for interactions with foreigners for election candidates, election agents, and political associations. The PSP part, as I said, is based on existing legislation the PDA ported over. Over the years, subversion has become an even more serious issue. Modern ease of communications, increased interactions, travel has made it inevitable that traditional spying and subversion increases in scope and intensity. This is happening in Singapore and elsewhere. Just to give some examples from the last few years, in 2017, an Australian former senator apparently received donations from an individual with connections to the PRC government, and he then advocated China's position on the South China Sea. A former chairman of the European Union Foreign Friendship Group was sponsored flights and hotel stays by a foreign government and subsequently voiced views that supported that government's policies on various issues. In 2019, leaked documents revealed that the Russian government was allegedly planning to provide financial and public relations assistance to the election campaign of German politician Markus Frohnmayer, who was known to be very outspoken in favor of ending sanctions and recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea. This has also happened in Singapore. Members would be familiar with the expulsion of academic Huang Qing in 2017 for collaborating with foreign intelligence agents. It was an attempt to influence senior decision makers in government. Moving on to the HIC part of the bill, the reasons are straightforward. Spying, subversion in another country is age-old. Using spies, agents, locals, useful idiots is all part of subversion. As technology developed, the subversion increased, adapted new technology, phone tapping, cameras, recording, microfilming, and so on. Now tech has evolved again, and the internet has created a powerful new medium for subversion. Countries are actively developing attack and defense capabilities as an arm of warfare equal to and more potent than the land, air, and naval forces. It's often seen as a fourth arm of service. The Gerasimov Doctrine, named after Russian Chief of Staff, identifies issues of, quote, protest potential, unquote, in another country, uses info operations to polarize that society, incite public disorder, keeps target country in a constant state of turmoil. Aggressors can more easily achieve their political and military outcomes. New communication tools facilitate non-kinetic forms of attack and make these harder to detect. For example, bots and digital ads can easily be bought to spread harmful information. Foreign actors can blend their activities with other authentic online users, which gives readers a false sense of reality. We have an annex that sets out more details on the Gerasimov Doctrine, the new communication tools, the HIC tactics used by foreign state actors. Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, can I ask for distribution of a folder which contains annexes A to I that I'm going to refer to?
Yes, please.
And we distribute them together so that it's easier.
Yes, please.
So may I proceed as being distributed?
Yes, please.
If members were to look at Annex A, paragraphs 1, 2, 3, and 4, refers to the Russians developing a military doctrine for the internet age. The doctrine took tactics developed by the Soviets, blended them with strategic military thinking about total war, and laid out a new theory of modern warfare. And 3, it specifies that objectives is to achieve an environment of permanent unrest and conflict with an enemy state, includes harnessing the protest potential of the population of a target country, deepening the divisions within there, increasing hostility among different groups, and getting them to distrust institutions. And 4, with this doctrine, the rules of war have changed. Non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals without using the force of weapons, including utilizing a range of actors and tools, hackers, media, businessmen, information leaks, disinformation. These are all part and parcel of the new warfare. Russians are said to have done this. We have no way of verifying that. The following examples, which I will refer to, are based on reports. Ukraine is said to have suffered extensive intervention. Russia allegedly deployed this doctrine for many years. One example, during the 2014 protests, sensitive fault lines were targeted to paint the Ukrainian government as a fascist, racist, xenophobic junta, and claimed that Jews were being terrorized and beaten, asserted that local Jewish leaders were appealing to international bodies for help, tried to weaken the resolve of the armed forces and the population to build popular support for Crimea to join Russia. And eventually, of course, we know Crimea was annexed. Czech Republic, our 2018 Parliamentary Select Committee received evidence that Russia had targeted extremists and fringe politicians to spread propaganda, undermine support for Ukraine, and caused 1/4 to 1/3 of the Czech population to believe that the Ukrainian government was fascist, and which resulted in the Czech government being unable to support the Ukrainians. So the HICs actually managed to change Czech foreign policy. Netherlands, during the Dutch referendum on the EU-Ukraine FTA, Russians pretended to be Ukrainians, inflamed local debates, supported by online disinformation campaign involving fake stories about Ukraine, and Dutch voters eventually voted against the FTA. Annex B sets out some of the details. If members were to see Annex B, page 8 refers to Ukraine. You will look at item 3, it's what I've referred to. Item 4, the use of tools. Page 10, para 6, the consequences as a result of the campaign. Page 11, the interference in the Czech Republic. Para 2 sets out how it has been successful. That 53% of the Czechs believed there is propaganda both for and against a foreign country in the Czech public space, and therefore they cannot trust anything. That's another objective that people try and achieve, make you distrustful of everything. And page 12, interference in Netherlands, the box sets out the reference to the FTA referendum. More recently, Russia was allegedly engaged in campaigns to erode trust in the EU's COVID-19 strategy and to spread skepticism of Western developed vaccines. As I said earlier, Russia has repeatedly mentioned, I'm repeating what others have said, and Singapore does not take a position on this. Countries other than Russia are also said to have been using these strategies. In May 2019, a disinformation network was traced to Iran. This comprised fake persons who sought to influence US policymakers and also reporters and academics to carry their views. Some of these were eventually published in legitimate publications. Annex C sets out more details of reports that have identified Iran as a foreign state actor. In December 2020, the BBC reported on a vast 15-year global disinformation campaign to serve one particular country's interest. This campaign spread over at least 116 countries, more than half of the world's countries, and targeted members of the European Parliament as well as the United Nations, involved the use of stolen accounts and at least 750 fake media outlets, which were amplified with the help of a legitimate foreign wire service. So you can see the use of legitimate news organizations. February 2021, the social media analysis firm Graphica released a report on propaganda coordinated network in favor of one country called Spammerflash Dragon, using a mixture of bots, fake accounts, stolen accounts, and so on to push and amplify videos and media targeting issues such as the safety of Western-made vaccines and discrediting the United States. A 2020 study by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found that there has been a significant increase worldwide in foreign interference between 2015 and 2020. At least 38 elections and 6 referendums were impacted. The international media regularly names Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. I don't know whether these countries in fact did what they are said to have done, but few doubt that they have the capabilities. It's notable that the US and other Western countries are not mentioned generally in these reports because they are Western media reports. But anyone sensible will know that the US, UK, Western countries have similar, or perhaps in the case of the United States, even superior capabilities. Really, there are no angels in this game. The Washington Post reported on the 11th of February 2020 that a Swiss encryption communications provider had sold devices to more than 120 countries. It was actually secretly owned, that company, by the CIA and the German intelligence. They had rigged the devices to read the encrypted communications of all the countries, 120-odd countries that had bought the system, reading secret, most confidential communications of their own allies and, of course, adversaries. The story was then released years after everything had been done and closed. Washington Post wrote up the expose based on a CIA internal history of the operation in 2004. So CIA history was in 2004. Washington Post released this story in 2020. And they also based it on an internal oral history project by the German intelligence in 2008. But everything was kept under wraps until simultaneously published by the Post and a German broadcaster on the 11th of February 2020. So it has all the hallmarks of a deliberate planned leak. Members might recall that at about the same time, a bit before that, but through that period, the US government was very seriously warning everyone about the dangers of relying on technology from China. So basically, without embarrassment, this leak came out saying, we did it, and now be careful about the Chinese. Have the Americans actually stopped? We can only guess. But it's now got to be taken as a given that this sort of thing will be done regularly, and everyone will face this. And it has become very easy and inexpensive to do. The Select Committee in 2018 heard that 1 million Instagram likes cost US $18. To get 100 Twitter followers, likes, or retweets, it cost 34 US cents. And to organize a street protest in the US through online cost about US $200,000. These details are in Annex D. It also gives examples of HICs targeting democratic processes, if you look at Annex D. And it's a cottage industry as well, because there are reports of an active Macedonian disinformation industry. Young Macedonians, they have internet access, some basic training to create fake news websites. And in the final weeks of the 2016 US presidential elections, over 140 fake news US politics websites were traced to Macedonia, and these overtook mainstream news producers in their share of election stories shared on Facebook. The details are in Annex E. Singapore, well, a few days ago, the French Military School of Strategic Research Institute published a report on influence operations. Singapore was among the countries featured as case studies. The report noted that there were several factors which made Singapore vulnerable: our size, our hyperconnectivity, our multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Report said we were resilient through a counter-narrative of Singaporean identity and by our swift reactions to hate speech. It concluded that we, along with Sweden, were one of the best prepared states in the fight against information manipulation and hybrid threats in general. I'm not so sanguine as the people who wrote this report. Our racial and religious mix is easily exploitable by different countries, and we see a steady buildup of different narratives which is being very cleverly done. It's not obvious propaganda, but it conditions people to think in certain ways, particularly on foreign policy issues, often appealing to a larger racial identity beyond the Singaporean identity. In my view, this is one of the most serious threats we face, and our population, and I think most members of parliament, are not really aware of this. Singapore, of course, has been subjected to attacks in recent times, both cyber attack as well as cyber manipulation. A cyber attack in 2018, the hackers targeted SingHealth's database, stole the particulars of 1.5 million patients, including the Prime Minister's data. Cyber manipulation, I'll give a couple of examples. During a period of tension with another country between 2016 and 2017, we experienced a coordinated HIC that attempted to undermine our foreign policy position. Online commentaries and videos were uploaded by social media accounts which had lain dormant for many years. Many of these were in Mandarin and targeted our Chinese-speaking population. These contents were also widely circulated via chat apps and aimed to influence sentiments amongst Singaporeans. In another case, during a period of bilateral tension with a country in 2018, we saw a large spike in online comments critical of Singapore, and many came from anonymous accounts. They sought to give an artificial impression of widespread objection to Singapore's position. I will say so far these have been relatively low level, except the strategic move, the attempts to condition our people's thinking, which is going on. Before I deal with the substantive points on this bill, let me also deal with the issue of timing. Some have said there have been no discussions. Why is the bill being put through so quickly? Have there been no discussions? We have been talking about this very seriously for more than 3 years, extensively. The Select Committee heard extensive evidence in 2018 on this. The evidence, the reports that I've been referring to so far in the various annexes, most of it come from the evidence given in 2018 to the Parliamentary Select Committee. I would like to refer members to Annex F. It sets out the discussions that have taken place and a summary of the testimonies given at the Select Committee. 20 different types of evidence, persons, organizations, including experts, gave evidence on the seriousness of the foreign threat. I will touch on some of the evidence that was given at the Select Committee. Disinformation expert, Mr. Ben Nemo, testified on the Internet Research Agency's various tactics, IRA, said to be controlled by Russia, tactics to boost support for Mr. Trump, as he then was, and opposition to Mrs. Clinton during the 2016 US presidential elections, and to widen the divide in the US between Black Lives Matter movement and the police. Dr. Lemonnier, a French cybersecurity expert, spoke of an alleged Russian HIC that tried to sway the 2017 French presidential elections, using a combination of state media, social media platforms, and bots, including by attempting to spread leaked emails on the eve of the election to discredit the Macron campaign. Experts also highlighted that Singapore has been targeted and is especially vulnerable when race and religion is used as an issue of protest potential. Dr. Sashi Jayakumar said that it would be a mistake to assume that foreign HICs were not already happening. Dr. Guliza gave testimony behind closed doors because of the sensitivity and said there were indicators of information warfare being practiced against Singapore. Dr. Liu Kai-kyun highlighted the barrage of comments by seemingly Myanmar-based user accounts on social media news portals of Singapore's mainstream news networks. These were inflammatory with Islamophobic tones and incited backlash from Singaporean Muslims. Dr. Michael Ruska highlighted that foreign states could engage in information operations that target our fault lines as a means of asymmetric warfare, given Singapore's traditional military strength. This is an important point that I will ask members to take note of. I once heard our then Defense Minister, Dr. Tony Tan, describe our defense strategy in the following terms: that Singapore's defense strategy is predicated on the superiority of our military in the region. Our conventional military strength has got to be clearly superior, and it is clearly superior. The SAF is very well regarded, both in the region and globally, for its professionalism, its technological edge, and the interoperability of our systems. What Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, the vision of poisoned shrimp. But what that means, as Dr. Ruska pointed out, that the internet becomes a particularly attractive theater for our adversaries who would seek to do us harm. I will ask MPs to register this point in particular because our conventional military superiority ironically means we become an even bigger target online. This topic was also quite extensively referenced in the Select Committee report and discussed several times in Parliament. And if you look at Annex F2, that sets out the discussions that have taken place in Parliament. There were questions, answers emphasized our vulnerability, the fact that the Select Committee recommended that measures be taken, and we have said that in Parliament that legislation will be considered, legislation will be necessary. I made speeches in COS 2019 as well as COS this year and made it clear that legislation was needed. You can also refer to my speech at a major international conference in September 2019. That's, I think, way down because there's been so much on this, pages 26 and 27. I did at that point reference Mr. P.J. Tham and Ms. Han. I'll come back to this. And I made it clear that legislation is going to be needed. That conference was held in Singapore on the 25th of September 2019 with 10 international and local speakers, experts. Professor Alan Rock, a former Canadian cabinet minister, at that conference noted that tools of interference were well known, dissemination of false information, hacking, leaking, and he said governments have got to take this seriously and take countermeasures, protect the electoral system, the candidates, political parties, and voters from information manipulation. And this topic of foreign interference has been extensively covered in the media as well. And that's set out in Annex F3. And if you look at the headlines on some of them, repeatedly, or it says, about stronger laws planned to combat foreign interference, and Singapore to have legislation to combat increased risk of foreign interference. And Annex F4 shows, I've just given a small sample of extensive studies internationally, Brookings Institution, Rand Institute, Council for Foreign Relations, they have all commissioned and published studies. So this topic has been extensively discussed and debated for over 3 years. The other comments made, there's a very long bill. MPs are used to lengthy bills. You understand the structure, you understand what are the key provisions, you understand the explanatory statement, you take a view, and then you go through all the provisions again, look at the accompanying statements, infographics, and get a better stance. And as I've said, more than half of this bill is based on the PDA, which MPs will or should be familiar with. And the rest on HIC, it's set out fairly comprehensively. I think the threat of foreign interference and its seriousness is not disputed by most people. Most people also agree that something needs to be done. So this is the context in which we are moving this bill. Before we consider the bill, it's useful to first consider the current powers to deal with subversion. Today, assume a person X is suspected of being a foreign agent or acting for a foreign agency against Singapore's interest. Such a suspected foreign agent can be detained without trial under the Internal Security Act. Investigations can be conducted. Section 20 of the CPC allows the police to ask anyone in Singapore, individuals as well as companies, for information, not just under the ISA, under any legislation if there are investigations. Ask anyone in Singapore, individuals as well as companies, for information, require them to produce any document or item for investigation. So, under current laws, suppose there is an online campaign and there is a basis to believe that this is foreign agency or entity inspired and that it's prejudicial to our national security, then investigations can be conducted under ISA. Information, including the writer's identity, will have to be made available under the CPC. The writer and anyone else suspected of subversion can be detained. Any challenge will be heard by the ISA tribunal, not by the High Court, and it's not public unless the ISD decides to make it so. This applies equally whether the subversion is done online or in the physical world. One of the pieces of misinformation that has been put out is that FICA would now allow the government to get any information and that this is a new power. Section 20 of the CPC has been used all these years, and it is in broad terms to get any information for investigations. When we talk about powers, the powers to detain, to investigate, I will refer to them as substantive powers. The powers to enforce, like requiring the taking down of material, I will refer to them as executory powers. There are also several executory powers now available, including under the Broadcasting Act, which allows the government to deal with objectionable content in the internet space. It allows for directions to be issued to broadcasting licensees for content to be taken down or blocked. The Telecoms Act has powers, gives powers to allow for directions to be issued to telecom licensees in the public interest, including the stopping, delaying, censoring of messages. The Public Order Act allows the government to regulate physical assemblies and processions, and the Commissioner of Police may deny permits for such events that are directed towards a political end and involve foreign entities or individuals. So the issues of what the Russians might call the protest potential are regulated in the physical world. Logically, similar rules should apply in the online space. The current Political Donations Act requires those that are directly involved in our political processes be they political parties, election candidates, their agents, they have to declare their political donations. The Act prohibits the receipt of foreign funding and has a cap on anonymous donations. So I've taken the House through the current legal landscape. What does FICA add to the current powers? Take the example I gave earlier. Say X is acting for a foreign agency. He has an agenda to subvert, influence our political process, subvert our sovereignty and he conducts an online campaign. Today, as I have explained, action will be taken under the ISA. And bear in mind that foreign agencies will often use legitimate-looking fronts. Annex G sets out the examples of such legitimate-looking fronts. If FICA is passed, then we can proceed under FICA if we can show that online communications activity has been prepared or planned by or on behalf of a foreign principal, and it is in the public interest to give one or more directions. Example of directions that can be issued include for a communicator to take down his content, for an internet intermediary to take down the content, and for an internet intermediary to suspend or terminate the account. The person can also be arrested, prosecuted if an offense of clandestine foreign interference is made out. But under FICA, there's no detention without trial. Public interest is defined as including activities directed towards a political end. That is taken from the Public Order Act to prohibit foreigners from organizing or taking part in public assemblies directed towards such ends. And FICA applies this definition to the online space. The executory powers under FICA are more calibrated. I referred earlier to the Broadcasting Act, and directions can be issued. Telecoms Act, directions can be issued to telecom licensees. And both acts, there are limits to judicial review. So what in the HIC part of FICA goes further than the current laws, mainly in extraterritorial application, because it now explicitly includes global platforms, which are often vectors for HICs. So that updates the analog powers for the internet age. For example, in the analog world, you have the Newspaper and Printing Presses Act and the Broadcasting Act. Provides powers to proscribe foreign newspapers' broadcasting services. The digital equivalent under FICA is a proscribed online locations app removal. In the analog world, the Broadcasting Act provides the power to order a TV station to carry a message. The digital equivalent under FICA is a must-carry direction issued to communicators' social media services. I would ask members to refer to Annex H, which has two charts. First, chart 1, and this is quite important. If you look at chart 1, the existing powers are in light green, and the updated powers under FICA are in darker green. So on the left, what's headed substantive powers. Today, you see the existing powers for investigation and of arrest and detention in light green. It can be seen that FICA is an update to ensure that our laws can deal with online HICs by allowing for disclosure of information by global platforms and new offenses which have to be proven beyond reasonable doubt in court for perpetrating HICs in a clandestine way. If you look at the top right-hand side, it shows how existing laws cover foreign interference via traditional media, the Broadcasting Act, the NPPA, and the Broadcasting Act. And the bottom right, the light green boxes show how online there are powers to intervene under the Broadcasting Act and the Telecoms Act. What FICA does in dark green boxes is targeted and more calibrated directions. If you look at chart 2, the existing PDA is in green, FICA is in pink or red. On the left, the green box shows what PDA provides today. All the measures in that box apply to gazetted political associations. Under FICA, at the first instance, the only measure that applies to a designated PSP is in the first red box in the second column, which is declaration annually of donations. If there is a heightened threat of foreign interference, then the other red boxes can be applied by the competent authority. To use another example, suppose we discover that a Singapore company has been secretly hired by a foreign intelligence agency to put out memes and videos on social media and to spread the view that a particular ethnic group is persecuted. And the aim, let's say, is to drive a wedge between ethnic groups in Singapore. What will we do today? The company's officers can be detained under the ISA. Other laws can also potentially be used. This can be reviewed if the detention is under the ISA by the ISA tribunal. There is no judicial review, except in relation to compliance with procedural requirements under the Act. Where the content crosses the threshold of other laws like the Penal Code, of course, the criminal investigations can be initiated. The CPC comes in. That will allow any information about the company's activities or that of its staff to be obtained. And there is a legal obligation by anyone in Singapore to provide the information when the police ask for it, including internet companies. And these actions can be preemptive. Under FICA, directions can be issued to tech companies to disable access to the content or restrict those accounts from view of end users in Singapore if the thresholds are met. These can stem the HIC without having to block the entire platform. Social media platforms can also be asked to provide information to support an investigation into a HIC. Today, if this data resides abroad, we cannot do so under the CPC. The government would also have the option of charging the company and its officers under FICA for clandestine foreign interference and prosecuting them in open court. So that deals with the HIC part of FICA. There has been some degree of misrepresentation on FICA that this bill seeks to curtail normal interactions with foreigners. That is not true. Singapore depends for its success and vitality on being open. And a government that seeks to close down that will lead Singapore to ruin. I actually want the House to see how our approach compares that with the US and Australia. In the US, under the Foreign Agents Restriction Act, it covers people and organizations that are under the control of a foreign government or organizations or persons outside of the United States. Under the US's FARA, a foreign principal is defined very broadly, and any political activity that is designed to influence government decision-making on behalf of a foreign principal will require or trigger a registration. For instance, take something that we take as normal. An American citizen meeting a US congressman and advocating for his company's product. If the company was a foreign company, an MNC, that will trigger registration. So the American provision is quite broad. That scenario will not meet the thresholds for designation of PSPs under FICA. On the HIC part and how it applies, I'll deal with it later. Let's also look at Australia, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. This covers government-related entities and individuals who have arrangements with foreign principals or undertake certain activities on behalf of foreign principals. So under Australia's FITS, any activity by a former Commonwealth politician would trigger the threshold for registration. So you could be an ex-minister or an ex-member of parliament of any political party, and if you did this, it will trigger. Singapore, under FICA, on the PSP part, only covers defined and designated PSPs, a much, much, much narrower group. Why have we taken this approach? Because we are not the US, we are not Australia, we are Singapore, we are an international hub. Interactions with international counterparts, business people, siting of MNCs in Singapore, all of these are vital for us. In this bill, action can be taken in respect of HIC if the following conditions are satisfied. Internet activity by or on behalf of a foreign principal and public interest in Singapore is affected. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but in essence. A PSP designation is possible if the activities are directed towards a political end and it is in the public interest that countermeasures should be applied. So one of the key points for both areas is the phrase public interest. The definition of public interest includes the requirement of proportionality, which the minister or authority will have to consider in arriving at a decision. The public interest test imports a built-in requirement of proportionality for the minister before deciding on a Part 3 direction. And the definition of public interest refers to necessary or expedient. And that's clause 7. So if a decision has to be made on the basis of that it's necessary or expedient, you've got to look at the facts carefully, and the actions you want to take must be proportional. So take an example. Two academics, one of them foreign, collaborate on a paper on LGBT issues. It will be difficult to say it is necessary or expedient to issue directions under FICA and really try explaining that to a Supreme Court judge who will chair the tribunal, that it's necessary or expedient. So the vast majority of collaborations, linkages, will not meet the required conditions. And they will also not meet the requirement of proportionality. And as an aside, and this has been raised by Member of Parliament Mr. James Lim, if a foreigner writes articles on controversial issues using his own name or clearly stated to be a foreigner, people can assess the value, credibility, weight, and it's generally unlikely to be necessary or expedient to issue directions. But it depends on the facts. If there is a basis to believe that he is doing so, for example, as part of a hostile campaign or is acting for a foreign agency with the intent of causing damage to Singapore, then directions could be given subject to the test of proportionality. And if he disagrees, he can appeal to the tribunal. Likewise, and again, I think this arises from Mr. Lim's question, or rather his proposed amendments. If The Economist or New York Times publish articles, it will not be possible to invoke FICA. However, if there is more to it, if a foreign newspaper is being used as part of a campaign targeting Singapore, that may be different. But again, comes back to proportionality, the nature of the actions, the likely effect, the likely intent, several other factors. Newspapers, it doesn't mean automatically they are all kosher. They have often been used as a front for such activities, which is why I put Annex G in. Legitimate newspapers, newswires have all been used as fronts. So you cannot give a carte blanche exception, but it is most unlikely that many of these would be a front unless we have very clear other evidence. If some deception is involved in the campaign, if the foreigner hides his identity or masquerades as a local, we could, under FICA, give orders for them to be transparent. Just disclose who you are so that people can judge for themselves. And collaboration and partnership with a foreign person by itself is not the trigger. You have to go further and look at the facts. As I said, is there a hostile campaign? Is there damage to Singapore? Is there a foreign agency involved? What is the extent of possible damage? I mean, these are non-exclusive factors, nor must they all be present or any one of them present. You really got to look at the facts, assess based on what you know, and assess the proportionality as well. Now, I've referred to proportionality. I said this is my view, but this is what the government has been advised by AGC, and that's one of the reasons for my view. I mean, I'm capable of forming my own views, but we go by advice from AGC. And this is the intent behind the legislative approach, which we are setting out clearly for reference, so that if this bill becomes law, and if it needs to be interpreted, it will be interpreted in the light of what the government has said is the legislative intent and how the phrases are intended to cover these things. It has been suggested by some that case law means that the test of proportionality cannot be applied. The advice I get from AGC is that it's different for this legislation because we are making clear the legislative intent for this specific bill. And I have made similar points in respect of other legislation as well. It's a part of the second reading speech. Now, I will, in this context, invite members to look at Annex I. Perhaps, sorry, I made a mistake. Annex I is not in hard copy. I think, sir, with your permission, it will be emailed directly to them in soft copy, but I'll just take you through some. Yeah, sorry, part of Annex I is there, but the part that I want to refer to, I've expressly excluded. No, that's just a joke. We didn't have time to put that in. The one suggestion was, open non-clandestine collaboration between Singaporeans and any ordinary private foreign citizen to improve any aspect of our laws and public policies constitutes foreign interference, notwithstanding the absence of any foreign state manipulation or foreign funding. Let me put it this way. On the one side, if there is manipulation with a foreign agency involved, I think everyone will agree it's quite clear. On the other side, there is foreign collaboration, bona fide work. Everyone will agree that cannot be. And then there is an in-between. There could be a group of foreigners, working with Singaporeans, exchanging viewpoints, writing papers, and so on. We have indicated that that would not be covered. How does that become necessary or expedient? How is the test of proportionality satisfied? But supposing they would come together and their motive is to effect change. Or take a different example, there's money involved. Or let's say there's materiality, the entire focus is political change. Then again, MPs will see that's a very different kettle of fish. Or for that matter, range of public policy issues that are currently or which may in the future become subject to political debates, where there is legitimate reason for concerned Singaporeans to collaborate with international experts, researchers, NGOs. On the face of it, that would not be covered. But if it changes along the lines of what I said earlier, then there is a case for looking at it carefully. So one has got to look at the facts, test materiality. Another point that has been made is that presenting research at overseas conferences, writing for international journals, multi-author book projects, publishing in and reviewing for prestigious academic presses, participating in international collaborative research projects, partaking of fellowships, visiting appointments, training programs, participation in international funding opportunities. Any of these may be subsidized or fully funded by foreign universities, foundations, and states. None of that on the face of it, as described, will fit within FICA for the reasons I've already explained. But if there is a step up to try and turn the person into an agent of influence, or there is an orchestrated campaign, then again it becomes different. So some of these doomsday scenarios that FICA is going to close off foreign collaborations, if that is correct, we as a government must have suddenly gone mad. Because in a country like Singapore, which depends so much on the flow of ideas and international collaboration, is that even thinkable? But the difficulty we face at MHA, and which many other countries face when dealing with this foreign interference issue, is that out of 10,000 interactions, one might be the sort that we are interested in, where there is an attempt to interfere. And foreign agencies, and even non-agencies, NGOs, others, will try and present a legitimate front. So the language has got to be broad enough to cover that what is apparently normal, but is actually not normal. And it's not only the classic foreign state agency subversion sort of thing. It could be foreign associations, NGOs, even individuals who want to change our laws, for example. But so you got to look carefully at what they are doing. What are all the factors taken in overall? Using the proportionality test. What sort of issue are they focusing on? What's the possible impact? Is there funding involved? But the central guiding principle that Singaporeans should primarily decide on issues of importance to ourselves. If you turn specifically to academics, questions have been raised about their collaborations with non-Singaporeans. They collaborate, create, partner, pursue their research interests professionally. No HIC. It doesn't come within FICA. So the bill will not affect the vast amount of academic work that is being done. We value the intellectual output, collaborations, exchange of ideas, the work our academics do. And they need to link with the rest of the world for work, bona fide and professional work, not affected. It is important for Singapore. But in some situations, there are academics who go into a different realm around the world, and they are dealt with like we did with Huang Jing. There is another threat to some of the points made, underlying all of these explanations and illustrations, that the government's position and explanations are good, but the powers can be abused. They can be used for a wrong purpose. The worry is that the government will abuse its power and shut down legitimate cooperation because it doesn't like it. So there are 2 points here. One, the powers that are necessary to deal with the threat. Second, the possibility of abuse of these powers. So far I've explained why the powers are necessary and why these powers are no more extent, in fact less so than the powers that already exist, but it's more calibration for the internet age. So bearing that in mind, I will deal separately later with abuse of powers. But fundamental principle is the intention, and we do not believe the legislation prevents bona fide exchange of ideas. Can a government abuse the power? Any government can abuse this power and any power. So we'll come to that and what should be the checks and balances for that. There have also been others beyond these concerns, others who have been actively trying to put out misinformation about the bill. Chief amongst them, Mr. Tham and Ms. Kirsten Han. Tham and Han, as I said in 2019 in the conference, take money from George Soros. Some of you may recall Soros Open Society Foundation's OSF has a history of getting involved in the domestic politics of sovereign countries. So in 2018, Accra rejected Tham and Han's attempt to register a company funded by OSF to organize democracy classroom sessions in Singapore. They have set up an organization called New Narrative, which receives significant foreign funding. New Narrative organized a series of democracy classrooms focusing on Malaysia and supported by the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. Make no mistake about it, we will say no to that in Singapore. You can organize democracy classrooms. We have no issues. Anyone can organize, anyone can criticize the current state of democracy, but it cannot be funded by Soros or the US Embassy or any other embassy. The nature of activity and who the funding is from will have to be considered in this context. I'll say a bit more about Tham and Han before I go on to discuss their objections. Tham wants our Independence Day to be 16th of September, which is Malaysia Day. He regrets that Singapore separated from Malaysia. On several occasions, he has publicly said that Singapore should become part of Malaysia again and celebrate independence on 16 September. Tham and Han and some other activists met with Dr. Mahathir on the 30th of August 2018. They asked Dr. Mahathir to bring democracy to Singapore I suppose, Malaysian-style democracy. Han described a social movement as, and I quote, the work that goes into potentially one day having 500,000 people on the streets. She has also said, when the government says foreigners should not influence domestic affairs, or foreigners should not bring their country's politics into Singapore, we should push back on that as well, because why not? Because solidarity is important. Her view is that Malaysians can influence our politics. She says so openly. And I believe, I haven't seen it, but I assume the petition that the PSP is presenting in Parliament is the one that is inspired by Ms. Han. So I would like to know whether they agree with this statement that Singaporeans should push back and say foreigners should be able to influence domestic affairs in Singapore. So members can see why the two of them are very concerned that FICA will focus on foreign funding and have been mounting their own disinformation campaign. Han has been posting on social media extensively, told over 100 tweets, posts and so on, organized a petition, sent around email templates for people to write to their MPs. Tham has meanwhile written a commentary calling this bill a stealth coup by me, basically that I am personally going to take over Singapore, and all my colleagues have to be very concerned. And I suppose a coup means that I take over from the Prime Minister. A coup in Singapore. Prime Minister needs to be very concerned too. It requires a turn of mind completely at odds with reality and living in fantasy to think of a coup in Singapore. Mr. Tham forgets that if that is his fear, that I am going to mount a coup, then I or any Minister of Home Affairs has far more powers under other legislation, the ISA, the CLTPA, the MRHA, including the powers of detention. FICA, in contrast, is a toy gun. It gives powers to give directions. So members can see there is no limit to the absurdities and fantasies that some will put out. And an Oxford education is in itself does not immunize one from spouting such nonsense. But I can see that they are concerned. Han has said in arguing against this bill that it's difficult to get money for these causes in Singapore, so foreign funding is necessary. So you can see, I mean, if Singaporeans are excited about it, interested, they will contribute. Or because they won't contribute, therefore I need foreign funding. Mr. Terry Shu has joined Han in starting the petition, which some groups have signed up to. I'm not sure how many of these groups know what Tham and Han's objectives are. We will look at the petition later that's being put up in Parliament by PSP. And I think members can look at it in the context of who inspired them and how today's PSP is completely aligned, it appears, with what Tham and Han want to achieve. Mr. Speaker, sir, if the points raised in the petition, assuming it is the same petition that we see online, I have dealt with most of them, I'm dealing with them. We can debate the points today, and I would say Parliament can fully consider and debate the points today. There's no need to do it at another session. Mr. Terry Shu, as many of us know, and as I said in the September 2019 speech at the conference, uses Malaysian and other foreign writers to write incendiary articles on Singapore without bylines and without identification, The articles include a call for Singaporean civil servants to march on the streets like their Hong Kong counterparts. So you read the articles. What will readers think? These are from local writers writing about Singapore in these terms. But the articles are often by foreign writers who are paid to write these stories. The more incendiary, the better. Now, Mr. Shu and others can continue to do this even after FICA, but a direction can be given to them to make it clear that the article is by a foreigner. We all want transparency, right? So it'll be useful for Singaporeans to know whether the writer of the article is local or foreign. FICA will allow us to issue a transparency directive requiring Singaporeans to be told upfront who the article is written by, what nationality the author has. Now, sir, moving on to a slightly different topic. For HIC directions, appeals go to an independent reviewing tribunal, which has the power to overrule the minister. The tribunal is headed by a Supreme Court judge. Appeals are made to this tribunal and not the court so as to protect sensitive information that may be relied on to make a decision. For example, we may determine that foreign interference based on a tip-off, sensitive information shared by a foreign counterpart security agency, and the consequences of a leak would be very serious. Most Singaporeans understand the need for this legislation. So I'll now deal with the proposed amendments put forward by various members or some members of the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party has stated that they believe in, I quote, the legitimate need to counter malign acts of foreign interference. They also realize the purposes provision of the bill is important, that's clause 2, and obviously so. So with your permission, Mr. Speaker, may I distribute a second folder which comprises annexes J to L that I'm going to refer to now.
Please do.
If I may carry on while it's being distributed, sir.
Yes, please.
It is to be welcomed that the Workers' Party has set out what they disagree with in the bill. They are looking at the amendments in agreement with most of the bill. The details are in Annex J. Their disagreement with the bill can be itemized into 5 categories. 2 of the categories are somewhat process-related. The first one by Mr. Pereira, he has put in suggested amendments to clauses 47, 48, 78, 79, 81, 84, 85. He wants the government to maintain a public registry of all individuals and entities designated as PSPs, persons with declared involvement in foreign policy organizations. Now, I would say the bill does not use the term foreign policy organization. I assume he was referring to a foreign political organization instead. He also wants the government to make publicly available the following information: all reportable arrangements, all transparency directives, disclosures, reports, and explanations for these decisions, all directives to PSPs to end their affiliation with a foreign principal or to prohibit foreign volunteers. Now, it's unclear to us why he only wants to make public these 2 stepped-up countermeasures and did not include the other stepped-up countermeasures on prohibition of donations and foreign memberships. The bill in clause 116 states that we may make public any designation in the issuance of any stepped-up countermeasures on PSPs and transparency directive issued. The media had asked us this previously, and we said that while the bill says may, our intention, though, was to make public the designations and stepped-up countermeasures on PSPs, as well as the directives to counter a HIC. And our response was carried in mainstream media on the 25th of September. Mr. Pereira wants to have this as an obligation for the countermeasures that they have identified. The government can agree to this. We will make public all designations, stepped up countermeasures on PSPs, transparency directives, and HIC directives, except the TADs, technical assistance requirements, because that will be in the course of investigations, and we do not want to tip off hostile actors about the investigations that are going on. There is one issue on the suggestion to make public the names of citizens involved in foreign political and legislative organizations. A substantial number of these citizens may not be PSPs. The reporting requirement under Clause 79 applies to non-PSPs, ordinary citizens. If they are a member of the, say, the Russian Communist Party, we want to know, and they may not be PSPs in Singapore. There are also other communist parties. If they are members of the Cuban Communist Party, we also want to know. Likewise, if they are members of the UK Conservative Party. So it could become quite wide, and we have to be mindful when making disclosures relating to this group. So we are studying that particular issue, whether we should make all these non-PSPs reports public. Our previous intention was no, we should let them have the privacy on this. Reporting to the government is enough. But given that Mr. Pereira has raised it, we will relook at that particular point. And if we agree with him, we could make that amendment at a future point in time, but not now. Mr. Pereira also wants a list of all reportable arrangements. I do not think that is necessary. The bill sets out clearly the conditions where an arrangement is reportable. For example, when the PSP is obliged to act in accordance with the instructions of a foreign principal. The second category, where the Workers' Party wants to make some amendments, Mr. Gerald Giam, he wants to add the following to categories of PSPs. Members of Central Executive Councils or equivalent of registered political parties in Singapore, senior public servants holding office of Deputy Secretary or above or equivalent, board members or chief executives of a statutory board or government company listed on the fifth schedule, in the fifth schedule of the Constitution. I'll come back to this. The third category of amendments, Mr. Giam wants to amend definition of what amounts to directed towards a political end. And the fourth category of amendments is Clause 17. Mr. James Lim wants to remove the phrase likely to be from is or likely to be prejudicial. And he proposes similar edits to Clause 18. And he also wants to amend Clause 17, subclause 2, to remove a caveat. The fifth category, the bill provides for a challenge to some directions issued by the minister to be dealt with by a tribunal headed by a Supreme Court judge. Ms. Hay wants this to be dealt with by the High Court rather than a tribunal headed by a Supreme Court. So I'll now turn to the specific amendments proposed and set out our views. On Mr. Pereira's amendments on clauses 47, 48, 78, 79, 81, 84, and 85, we can agree to several of them. I have set out my position. On Mr. Giam's amendment to clause 14, on amending the definition of PSP to add. Now, once you are designated as a PSP, there are a baseline set of obligations. Declaration of foreign affiliations, declaration of migration benefits, anonymous donations cap of $5,000, declaration of donations of $10,000 or more from permissible donors, no foreign volunteers, and so on. So if you take a CEC member or equivalent, we can agree to this. We can add them today at the committee stage. And I'll seek to move a set of amendments to the bill during the committee stage of proceedings and for these to be debated alongside the other proposed amendments filed by the other MPs on the bill. But insufficient notice has been given for these amendments from my ministry, necessarily because we are dealing with amendments in turn proposed by Mrs. Pereira and Gyam. So I'll be seeking your consent, sir, Mr. Speaker, as well as the general assent of members present to waive notice, and copies of these proposed amendments will be distributed to this House so that members can read them ahead. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, may I ask the clerk to distribute the proposed amendments?
Please do.
May I continue, sir?
Yes, please.
Mr. Gyam, beyond the I should have said on the CEC members. It is one of the reasons why we left it out. We did consider CEC members as well as branch secretaries to be included. But we left it out because on the side of the PAP to comply with this is not going to be difficult because all except 2 of the CEC members are PSPs anyway. So the obligations are more onerous for the other registered political parties because many, in some cases, none of the CEC members are PSPs. But in any event, as I've said, we can agree to it if that's what Mr. Gyam wants. Mr. Gyam also wants DSS and PSS, or DS and officers above the DS level, to be included as PSPs. Now, what's the status of DSS and PSS and what rules are they subject to? They are all subject to various tight rules and requirements which are tighter than the FICA requirements on PSPs. And they have to hold a valid security clearance throughout their appointment. They have to make annual declarations, including on investments, ownership, financial embarrassment, declarations on a variety of matters, going well beyond what PSPs have to do. They have to declare all gifts and entertainment, and they cannot work for other employers or engage in trade or business without explicit permission. And they can be directed to cease outside activities or divest investments if there is any perceived conflict. A list of their key obligations is set out in Annex K. The rules for PSPs are not as tight. PSPs cannot accept anonymous donations over 5,000, which really means they can accept anonymous donations under 5,000. And they can also accept above 5,000 from identified persons. Any deputy secretary or permanent secretary who accepts that will not remain in service for much after that. And they would be subject to severe disciplinary action if they contravene any of the rules. So politicians and others who may be PSPs play by different rules compared with senior civil servants. And if we impose on PSPs the rules that senior civil servants are under, I think it will be very difficult. Ministers are also subject to strict rules, except that political donations are possible. And Mr. Gyam and Mr. Pratam Singh will be aware of these requirements, having both been public servants themselves in the past. And I also do not think it's appropriate to classify them as PSPs. These senior civil servants are non-political, so we can't agree to this proposal. Mr. Gyam also wants to include board members, chief executives of stat boards, chief executives of fifth schedule companies. CEs of stat boards as public officers are subject to the same rules as DSS and above, and the points I've already made apply equally to them. As for board members, it would not be feasible to automatically define them as PSPs. It's preferable to use powers of designation instead. Board members, they will often have foreign members. You ask them to declare all donations received in home countries, migration benefits, all their foreign affiliations. Doesn't make sense. If we went out and asked, not these companies, but any other listed company, ask them if it will be feasible to impose these requirements on their foreign directors. They will tell you it is too onerous. They will have difficulties getting good people. And if you take banks and you impose these obligations on the scheduled companies, but you don't impose those obligations on their competitors who might be in the same business, then you make it difficult for the scheduled companies to get good people. It's the same for fifth scheduled companies. So leave it to the companies to choose people of integrity, and our security agencies need to be alert. Not just about them, but other directors of major companies in Singapore. So these additional proposals are impractical from a market point of view. Now I move to Clause 8. It's proposed by Mr. Giam. He wants to amend the definition of directed towards a political end in Singapore. The context is HIC directions can be issued if there is online communications activity where material is published in Singapore, it's undertaken by or on behalf of a foreign principal, and it is in the public interest to issue a direction such as to prevent foreign interference directed towards a political end. And for a PSP to be designated, that person or entity's activities must be directed wholly or in part towards a political end, and the competent authority must additionally assess that it is in the public interest for countermeasures to be applied. So changing this definition will affect how we can act against foreign interference. The meaning of the directed towards a political end in the bill has 7 parts. Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, may I display a slide with the definition on screen, please?
Yes, please.
The first 5, I think it's not the easiest to read.
This is like a missing annex.
It's totally unintentional. I think it is also in the schedule that I've handed up after Annex M. Yeah, pages 1 and 2 with what is proposed to be struck out, for those of us who can't read this. The first 5 are to promote the interests of a political party. Mr. Singh, if you're looking for it, it is in this schedule, in this folder that has been handed over. Okay, right. The first 5 are to promote the interests of a political party or a political significant entity in Singapore, to seek to influence the outcome of any election or referendum. 3, to seek to influence Singapore governmental decisions, including by trying to influence the public. 4, to seek to influence any aspect of proceedings of key public institutions, including Parliament, PCMR, and so on. And 5, to seek to bring about changes of the law or otherwise influence the legislative process. So Mr. Giam accepts all of these as legitimate, as being directed towards, legitimate meaning legitimate for purposes of defining what is directed towards a political end, and that these are necessary. But he wants to remove the last 2 paras, and Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, may I ask for slide 2 that highlights these changes to be put up?
Yes, please.
Again, it is in page 1 of the after Annex M of the handout that has been given. Mr. Giam wants to remove 2 sub-clauses, the first of which reads, to seek to influence public opinion on a matter which in Singapore is a matter of public controversy, and 2, to seek to influence any aspect or to promote or oppose political views or public conduct relating to activities that have become the subject of political debate in Singapore. Now, this is a little difficult to understand. Let me explain. Members will recall I've said a number of times that there are 3 conditions for a HIC direction and 2 for a PSP designation. So for HIC directions, to refresh members' memory, there has to be online activity where material is published in Singapore. It has to be done on behalf of a foreign principal, and public interest in Singapore is likely to be affected. For PSP designation, the person's or entity's activities must be directed wholly or in part towards a political end, and the competent authority must additionally assess that it is in the public interest for countermeasures to be applied. With Mr. Giam's proposal, if an issue is only within F or G, then no counter HIC directions can be issued and no PSP designation is possible. To put it in the form of an example, in other words, his position is that we should not stop foreigners from interfering to shape public opinion on matters of public controversy or to influence public views on a political debate. And this is so regardless of whether or not deception is involved. There are numerous scenarios that could fall under limbs F and G that may not be covered by one of the other limbs. For example, promoting some types of solidarity between members of one race or nationality with the aim that this can eventually help them have negative feelings towards other races, or promoting some types of religious piety with the aim that eventually they may take different views on matters of political debate in Singapore. If we believe that is being done, for example, at the direction of a foreign intelligence agency, with the ultimate purpose of creating divisions within Singapore, shouldn't we be able to act? If an intel agency in another country regularly pays someone in Singapore to write about these matters or support the policies of the Workers' Party or the PAP and gradually deepen divisions, enhance the protest potential, as General Gerasimov might have said, that wouldn't be covered. Frankly, sir, that goes against common sense. So when we had the debates on FICA, were we not having a political discussion? Under Mr. Giam's proposal, any foreigner trying to influence such a debate in Parliament would be covered by FICA. But any foreigner trying to influence a wider public on the same topics will not be covered when their discussion takes place outside, unless it can be shown that that was done in order to influence government policy. But members would have seen from the examples that I've put in the annexes on foreign influence, influencing public opinion is a key aspect of foreign manipulation. Here, reams and reams of examples. And look at the modus referred to in paragraphs 200 to 206 of the Select Committee report. I don't have it here, but members can check it out, where the SCR says the Russians built up internet presence in the US to influence. And this has been done regularly in other countries. As an example, The Guardian reported that YouTubers, bloggers, influencers in France and Germany were offered money by a PR agency with apparent connections to another state to spread falsehoods about COVID-19 vaccines. For example, death rate among the vaccinated with Pfizer is almost 3 times higher than the vaccinated by AstraZeneca. They were asked to, I quote, act like you have the passion and interest in this topic and avoid using the words sponsored. They were instructed that the material should be presented as your own independent view. So I would say, sir, it's not logical, if we look at this, that we agree that A, foreigners shouldn't influence, C is wrong. We shouldn't allow foreigners to influence or seek to influence Singapore government decisions. The E is wrong and should not be allowed. but foreign-inspired subversion on F and G are okay. But if you look at A, to promote the interests of a political party, and if you look at G, to influence or seek to influence any aspect or to promote or oppose political views or public conduct relating to activities that have become the subject of a political debate in Singapore. You can do A in a different way under G. That's what I meant earlier. And you could argue I was doing G and not A. So foreign-inspired subversion on F and G are not okay. And this is exactly what Gerasimov doctrine seeks to exploit. It seeks to identify issues of protest potential, use info operations to polarize society, incite public disorder along these issues, and keep the target country in a constant state of turmoil. Or take another example, the explanatory statement to the bill. Say there is a humanitarian crisis in country Z and becomes a hot topic in Singapore. Country Z then sets up Company Y in Singapore in a bid to sway public opinion. Company Y pretends to be a private local trading enterprise, but is really just a front for Country Z to influence Singaporeans. And to do this, Company Y sets up multiple personas online. And it puts out many commentaries online, pretending to be freelance journalists or experts in foreign politics, trying to manipulate Singaporeans to take a particular view of the matter. This is taken from the real-world happenings. With the deletions that Mr. Gyam has proposed, such conduct may fall outside of FICA unless it can be referred back to one of the earlier limbs. And I think it is not acceptable for us to allow such foreign interference and allow such manipulation of Singaporeans. Eventually, it will weaken our society. The shareholders of a sham company may even get paid for their actions, and there would be no offense. And no Part 3 directions can be issued, however pervasive the online campaign. You will have situations where F and G may overlap with other limbs. Limb C, influencing government decisions, is defined in Section 9 to include influencing the public on a process in respect of the government decision. If this is a matter of public controversy, it will overlap with F. As I said earlier, insofar as G covers influence of political views, this may overlap with matters under A, which promote the interests of a political party, or E, which aim to bring about the changes in the law. In this context, let us also look at the exemptions proposed by member James Lim. He proposes to exempt any activity undertaken by Singaporeans to exercise their right to discuss politics by expressing their own views on political matters, unless they are agents of a foreign principle. Second, he proposes to exempt an activity undertaken by foreign individuals or foreign publications reporting or commenting on Singapore politics in an open, transparent, and attributable way, even if their comments may be critical of Singapore or the government. Both proposals are modeled on my ministry's press release of 13th September, which was issued after the first reading of the bill, where we set out the powers under the bill and explained that it will not apply to these two situations in the context of Clause 120. It is unnecessary to write this in. It is not covered by the Act, period. I have said this in Parliament. The MHA statement has stated it. The explanatory statement to the bill, Clause 120, explains this. And you can't regularly be writing, and sometimes there may be a need to, but you can't regularly be writing into legislation both what is covered and also what else is not covered. Because the above two situations are not the only ones not covered. Many other issues also not covered. We clarified those in the press statement because people may have had these questions in mind. Let me move to Clause 17, which is clandestine publishing, and this is by MP Mr. James Lim. I think I should say as an aside, the Prime Minister is back. He missed the part about the coup and taking over his powers. But I'm sure you will read them. Clause 17 is now sought to be amended. The current wording is that the offense is committed if A publishes in Singapore and he does this on behalf of a foreign principal, and A has reason to believe that what is published is likely to be prejudicial to Singapore's interests in one of various ways, and he does this covertly and deceptively. Mr. Lim wants to remove the phrase, quote, is likely to be, close quotes. Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, may I ask the clerk to display slide number 3, which contains this amendment?
Please do.
Again, for those who can't read it, you can look at the handout. It's the gray file that has been handed out, I think. This proposed amendment will narrow the mental state. It's the very last page, Mr. Singh. The other.
Yellow file.
Oh, yellow file, I'm told. Yeah. Do you have it? Okay. It should look like this. You can take mine if you wish. Or DPM can share with you. Oh dear, I'm sorry. Okay. Right, okay. The phrase is likely to be is sought to be struck out. Now, if this edit goes through, then the prosecution must then prove that a person knew that it would likely to be prejudicial. Taking one step back, I would say we are using a slide rule here to try and measure and assess people who are going to come with bazookas. This will not work in the real world, even more so when it comes to clandestine foreign interference. Any decent intelligence service would know how to cover its tracks, conceal its linkages, and disavow knowledge. So under these proposed amendments, someone could take money from a neighboring country, attack us, publish allegations against the police or SAF or other institutions, cause unhappiness and unrest amongst our local ethnic communities. This can be done covertly and not disclose that he's taking money. Yet if the proposals are accepted, the person cannot be charged in court because the prosecution has to show that the person knew or had reason to believe that his actions would be prejudicial. The person could claim, for example, he didn't realize that his posts would be picked up by others and shared around. He didn't know it would be prejudicial. He had no reason to believe so. This is so even if we can prove that he took money from a foreign agency to put up the posts with the purpose of damaging Singapore. It's really like taking knives to a gunfight. So common sense is if you had reason to believe that your actions are likely to prejudice Singapore's interest, and you're acting for a foreign agency, you're acting covertly, secretly, it should be an offense. Now, I make broadly the same points for the proposed amendments to clauses 18, 40, and 75. Related to this, Mr. Lim wishes to amend clause 17.2 to remove a caveat that Y does not need to have in mind a particular foreign country or foreign principal in order to be considered to have committed an offense. This similarly narrows the mental state for the offense and means that the prosecutor must prove that the person is acting for a specific foreign principle, and it's impractical for the reasons I've already given. As a matter of principle, knowledge that there is a foreign principle and acting on his behalf should suffice even if the person doesn't know which foreign principal. I mean, does it matter that you're acting for country X or Y or Z, as long as you know that you're acting for some country? If I may move to clause 20, also the amendment proposed by Mr. Lim, the current wording is that the minister may authorize directions where, in the opinion of the minister, those conditions for HIC are satisfied. The MP wants to remove the phrase, I quote, or is suspected of being or having been undertaken. In practice, suspicion of links to a foreign principal would likely arise from a lead, an intelligence tip-off, other kinds of tip-off. If there is such a suspicion, security agencies would probe further, gather data, try to corroborate the information, ascertain if the lead is reliable, and they would require triangulation from a number of different sources. You recall the earlier example of a state that apparently worked through a PR agency to get social media influencers to discredit vaccines. People eventually got suspicious due to a combination of indicators. Suspicious instructions from the company to mask that they were being paid to push their messages. A company claimed to be based at an address in London but turned out to be not registered there. Company management from Moscow. Online presence that disappeared once people started raising suspicions. None of these indicators on their own prove a conclusive link to a foreign principal, but collectively they paint a suspicious picture. So if a foreign publication strongly attacks government policy and a local person is actively helping them and pushes out that content while accepting donations from them and taking effort to conceal the funding, and consistently over time circumstances look suspicious, but nothing can be done, if we cannot prove that the person was actually acting on behalf of a foreign principal. I think we must be able to act on reasonable suspicion, which is a threshold well established in law. Under FICA, the government would be able to take some measures, issue directions to take down harmful content, or a must-carry direction to inform the public that HIC is going on. And these are executory in nature. Thresholds do not relate to an offense. If the person receiving the direction is aggrieved, he can appeal to the tribunal. Clause 21, Mr. Lim wants to amend or delete the phrase actionable intelligence. Let's say you receive a tip-off from another agency. Sorry, not delete. He wants to add in rely on actionable intelligence. So what? We now call this agency to come and prove the actionable intelligence, or we get documents and produce them. There is a process. You can't just produce documents. And added on to that, Mr. Lim and his colleagues want this to be in court. How do you even prove these documents? How do you put any foreign intelligence agents on the stand? What is actionable intelligence? In the real world, tip-offs come from intelligence agencies, from certain activities, associations. Sometimes it can be definitive, a smoking gun. In the vast majority of cases, less definite. Links to a foreign state could be through ownership, funding, other associations. It requires piecing together of different data points. And I can tell Mr. Lim from experience, if ever we said that we are going to refer what they said to us publicly, immediately they will disavow all knowledge, and thereafter they will refuse to have contact with us. That's the real world. So we need to be practical, not theoretical in this, with an understanding of how intelligence operations work. There is another problem which lawyers will understand. What is the legal standard for actionable intelligence? It will replace suspects or has reason to believe, which is a concept which lawyers know and is well defined, or at least there's case law, and it will replace that with actionable intelligence. Essentially, the tribunal will have the right to consider the information available, which the government makes available, and decide whether the conclusion that the government has come to was justified. Let me now move to the final set of amendments. Clause 104, amendments proposed by Ms. Her. She wants to replace the tribunal with proceedings in the High Court. This is in respect of appeals against our counter-HIC directions, any Part 3 direction or declaration as a prescribed online location. The question is, should the appeals relating to HIC directions go to court, and should there be public hearings? In a court process, the government will be required to set out its case in public months in advance of the trial. Documents have to be exchanged. Witnesses must be available to give evidence. There will be cross-examination, and then the judge decides. And going back to my earlier example, assume we get an intel tip of foreign agency tipping us about someone, which has happened even quite recently, and which then led to us exercising powers under the Internal Security Act. There are no documents. Will we be able to get the foreign intel contact to come to court? As I said, they will just not hear us. We won't even get a response. And that will be the end of the cooperation. If we think the tip-off has some merit, we do our own investigations and then issue directions. If the person is not happy, he appeals to the tribunal. Tribunal members have the same immunity and protection as High Court judges. They consider any appeal brought under Section 92. Let me give you another example. Some countries, I'm not saying we do, but some countries have human assets in other countries. Let's say the information is obtained through such a human asset. You want to reveal that in court? Depending on the country the human asset is in, he may not live for very long after that. And even if he lives, he won't be free. One could ask, can you have the case in camera in court? That won't solve the problem. You have to file the evidence in court. A lot of parties get to see the file. Some of this information frequently is often known only to the 2 or 3 persons who need to know, even within the security agency. The minister doesn't get to see it or know about it unless it is necessary to brief the minister. Let me give you a simple illustration of the real world by referring to a case that is before the courts now, which is not anywhere in the category of cases we are now talking about, right, in terms of sensitivity. There is a case pending, an application by 17 prisoners awaiting capital punishment. They are making an application against the Attorney General. They seek various reliefs against the Attorney General. Various allegations have been made, which the AGC considers to be completely scurrilous and without basis, and being made to simply throw mud and stir. That is the AGC's view. They are represented by a local lawyer. The hearing is in chambers. The lawyers will know the hearing is in chambers. It hasn't been published yet. Details of the affidavits, everything cannot be published. But details of the plaintiff's affidavit appeared in a Malaysian news portal within a month of the application being filed, and the allegations relate to, they have a very, well, I was going to say they have a very strong racial undertones. In fact, they are about race. Someone wanted to make these assertions in court and then make sure they were published outside, which AGC considers absolutely scandalous. The info should not have been made public. It's a possible breach of rules. The lawyer claims that his instructing solicitor is from Malaysia for one of the plaintiffs. So now you investigate, and even if you take action for breach of rules, the info is public. In this case, the info is not security sensitive. But let's say you have highly secret intel information. First of all, does it make sense to hand it over to the very person who is a suspect or to his lawyers? And how do you have a court process? So the theory has to fit the practice. That is why we thought long and hard and then said, let's have a tribunal headed by a Supreme Court judge who can overrule the minister. The courts still have a role to play, and that's in the explanatory statement. They will ensure procedural compliance, proper exercise of jurisdiction, but they will not review the merits, other aspects of executory decisions taken under the bill. Now, as the House considers this, we must also look at this in the context of some other pieces of legislation we have in Singapore and what our approach to governance is. Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, may I display a slide 4, which compares different legislation.
Yes, please.
This is also in the yellow file. Now, we have legislation that provides for tribunals and limits the court's power of judicial review to achieve a variety of different objectives. And so far, Singapore has been successful in this balancing exercise. Let me explain. The starting point is always rule of law. It's fundamental, both for the well-functioning of society and to build a modern, economically vibrant society. At the same time, we recognize the normal judicial process is not best suited for specific matters. That is an exercise that requires careful consideration. Let me give a few examples. This is in Annex L. If you look at the MRHA, Maintenance for Religious Harmony, the minister can issue restraining orders. They are considered by the Presidential Council for Religious Harmony, which in turn makes its recommendation to the President to confirm, vary, or cancel the order. All orders and decisions of the President and the Minister and the recommendations of the Council are final and not subject to judicial review. During the second reading of the MRHA, I explained that where religious issues are concerned, the trial process may not be the best way to deal with it. It can deepen the fault lines, encourage martyrdom, inflame tensions even more. The restraining orders can impose a significant restraint on normal freedoms. The restraining order can restrain the person from addressing orally or in writing any congregation, require the person to stop communication activity, stop contributing to any religious publication, and restrain the person from holding office in an editorial board or committee of religious publication. The orders can be made against religious groups to prohibit a group from receiving donations from specific or all foreign donors, require the entire governing body of the group to be Singapore citizens, require the group to suspend or remove specific foreigners from office. So you can see the underlying philosophy there again. Part of it is foreign influence. In some ways, these orders are more serious than what can be made under FICA. The religious groups were initially concerned. We talked to them, we explained, we showed how our powers have been exercised under the previous MRHA, and they understood, and they accepted. Second, if we look at the Land Acquisition Act, this is your house, you're living there. You could have been living there all your life. The government can acquire under the Land Acquisition Act. Any appeal from the collector's awards have to be heard by an appeals board. Good reason. We learned from the experience of other countries. Small country, we decided if we want to reshape and develop Singapore, government must have a power to acquire land quickly, develop it, and not be tied up with the normal litigation process. In fact, the inspiration for our constitution, one of the places we looked to were India, and when it was taken, then Prime Minister decided the constitutional protection for land, which is in the Indian constitution, should be removed from our Constitution. So a person's property can be acquired, and it is a tribunal that decides on the value. The approach to land acquisition, the policy on land acquisition, underpins our entire public housing policy. Entire public housing policy, HDB policy. It underpins our entire industrial land policy and many other aspects. It's based on this unorthodox approach. If you look at the Immigration Act, Section 39A, no judicial review for any decision made by the minister or controller under the Immigration Act, save in relation to procedural compliance. If you look at the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act, financial penalties can be imposed, other orders can be made, appeal is to an appeal board, chaired by a person qualified to be a judge of the Supreme Court, may not even be a judge, person qualified to be a judge. And the appeals board determines its own procedures, and its decision is final. Decisions of the controller relating to issuance or cancellation of work passes, variations of its conditions, these are not subject to judicial review, save in relation to procedural compliance. The Internal Security Act. The ISA has been instrumental in ensuring our safety and security. It provides for detention without trial on executive order. Singaporeans understand and accept the ISA. It allows us to pick up would-be terrorists preemptively. In 2017, we picked up a 22-year-old kindergarten teacher, young, and our first female detainee. Do we wait until she does something, perhaps to the kindergarten children? She went through rehab and is now released. In any other country, she could not have been picked up. Well, there are countries where she could have been picked up, but I'm referring to the countries that we normally refer to. If she's not picked up, and if she goes overseas to one of the war zones, she might well not be alive today. But now she has the prospect of carrying on with her life, achieve her full potential. In the last couple of years, amongst those picked up were two teenagers. One wanted to carry out a knife attack in a mosque, and the other wanted to carry out a knife attack in a synagogue. Do we wait until they actually attack? What would be the harm to our social fabric? So the ISA has helped us avoid the bad incidents and hypocrisies we see elsewhere. Recall the incident in New Zealand on the 3rd of September 2021, when an extremist stabbed shoppers at a supermarket. You wake up in the morning, you go to a supermarket, suddenly someone comes and stabs you. The attacker was known to the security agencies. He was under surveillance since 2016 because of his support for the Islamic State ideology. But under New Zealand's laws, he could not be picked up. There have been other similar cases in the UK and in France, and NXM sets out the details. The global security think tank GlobSec examined 22 terror incidents in France since 2012 and noted that nearly 80% of the people behind those attacks had been on a terror watch list, and 97% had been on the radar of authorities. So with the ISA, 97% of those incidents could have been avoided and many lives saved. This included Said and Sheriff Kwachi, who were career criminals who killed 12 people in January 2015 in the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris. If you turn to the US, President Obama took office in 2008. He campaigned on the promise to close down Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo. He did not do so in the 8 years of his presidency. One reason closing Gitmo could mean that several of these hardcore detainees could be moved to the United States, and many Americans were opposed to that idea. To date, what we can check, we may be wrong, is that only one Gitmo prisoner has been transferred to the US for prosecution in the federal courts. We may be wrong about the exact number, but I think it's a very low number. Now, what is the theory? The theory, and the Americans have been preaching this to us for years on the ISA, there must be due process, you must not have detention without trial. This is, and State Department will tell us and publish lists. But when it comes to the US, there is due process in the US. They have all these hardened criminals, terrorists picked up from around the world. So they put them in Gitmo, which is in Cuba, and then they say, well, since this is outside of the US due process laws don't apply. And therefore, we can detain them without trial, and they don't get the benefit of US due process. And on top of that, basically, members know about the atrocities that were committed on the prisoners. Which is why I said, we look at the world as it is, and we avoid hypocrisies. We deal with it in a practical way. Doctors look at the ISD detainees. The justices of peace go there, see them. We give them religious rehabilitation. We don't throw away the keys. And after a while, many of them are released when they are rehabilitated. We don't allow ideology to stand in the way of doing right for society. When that ideology doesn't make sense, your ideology must be to do what is right for Singaporeans. If you go to the CLTPA, it also provides detention without trial. And I'm well aware that the Workers' Party has a different view both on the ISA and the CLTPA, though I don't know what will be the substance of the provisions they will replace the ISA with. But anyway, and therefore it may be difficult for them to philosophically agree with this, but I'm setting out the approach the government has taken. The CLTPA provides for detention without trial. It's a practical approach by then Prime Minister, Mr. Lee. Evidence will often not be available. People too frightened to give evidence. In fact, we inherited this from the British and then changed it. Some people will be too frightened to give evidence. In the longer term, more harm to society by leaving gangsters out in society. So better to give to the executive these powers to deal with some types of pernicious criminals. It has helped to keep our society safe. If we had stuck to the approach of looking at everything on the basis only of the rights of the persons accused in the way that, say, the US or UK looks at it, and without balancing the rights of society, we will not have the safe and crime-free society we have today. And the rights of the accused or detainees, both under the ISA and the CLTPA, are protected. They are dealt with by tribunals. So the question for this House is, how do we view the risks of foreign interference? How do we place the risks in the context of other legislation that I've referred to? Would it be possible to deal with these issues of foreign interference through a normal court process? Often we don't even name the countries involved. Can you imagine naming one of our neighbors in court or a much larger country? When we asked Hong Jing to leave, we didn't say who he was acting for. Why? The foreign policy and national security implications are too serious. The US can name any country that it wishes. But we are a price taker in this business of international relations. Also, how do you have a court process without leaks? So if you look at what can be done through executive order under FICA, directives can be issued for greater transparency. The government might ask some to disassociate themselves from foreigners if there is an increased threat of foreign interference, and compare that against land acquisition, against the orders that can be made under other legislation that I referred to. And also, it's not as if it's either a court process or nothing. There is a tribunal fully empowered, headed by a Supreme Court judge, and they can consider any appeal brought under Section 92. Quite a separate point doesn't arise here. Generally in legislation, the usual rules for judicial review limit review of the courts to reasonableness, legality, and propriety. That has been so in POFMA as well as in other legislation. Members can see, therefore, various pieces of legislation have conferred the government with generally worded discretion. Philosophically, the government has seen that as part of good governance to ensure that our laws are effective so that the government can act when it needs to. You need checks and balances, but the checks must be suited to the task and balanced against the risks. The risks, what are the risks? There are risks with giving any government any power, whether or not it is appealable to a court. There are always risks. It's a degree of risk. There are also risks in not giving power. The real issue is what powers should you give, what are the risks, and what are the risks in not giving the powers. The risk here, which underlies some of the concerns that have been raised and in some of the illustrations, because the government says these illustrations don't come within FICA, and then people say, well, what if the government abuses its power? I referred to it briefly earlier. And what if the government interferes with perfectly normal collaboration with a foreigner? It will be an abuse of power, but what if the government abuses its power? So you have to weigh the risks of a rogue government doing that versus a rogue foreign interference. The latter is a far greater risk. The risk of a rogue government abusing its power, first of all, what is the power compared with the powers in other legislation? Second, it can be looked at by a tribunal headed by a Supreme Court judge. All the decisions published, people can see and assess themselves, and ultimately, people have the final say in a highly educated, literate population like Singapore. The final say of both public opinion and public opinion expressed through elections. People in Singapore won't stand for a rogue government. The risk of not giving the power or requiring a court process will, in the context of the risks I have outlined, will severely compromise the government's ability to deal with the real risk of foreign interference, which has actually happened. I, like some of those who have made comments, and I'm sure everyone else here, wish that there is a world where the government has the power to act, and at the same time there is a complete check against abuse. If we can find that formula, we will gladly take that, because that's ideal. But there is no such formula. Then we have to look, first of all, admit that there are trade-offs, whichever route you take. If you go to court, there are trade-offs. If you have a tribunal, there are trade-offs. And I agree, with the rogue government, there is a risk of abuse, as I said, not just of this power, but several other powers. And not just the powers which are executive powers, but also even powers which can be looked at or appealed to the courts. Just as there's a risk of an order made under MRHA against preachers on religious groups that we don't agree with, or detentions under the CLTPA, or land acquisition. In many countries, the populations don't support these kind of land acquisition powers because it only leads to some very wealthy ministers and no or not much public benefit. But in Singapore, the population trusted the government, and Singapore has developed in a way which could not even have been dreamt about in 1965. And along the way, we have had to make these choices in a number of areas, as I showed to members. And over time, people have seen how our approach proved to be good for the majority of people. And over the same period, Singapore's reputation for rule of law, its judicial system, legal system, institutions, both in and outside of the legal field, were all enhanced and they were built up. So I say to this House, this law gives the government a set of tools that can help. It is not a complete defense against foreign interference, but they can help. The bill represents the best balance that we can find between dealing with the risks and providing checks against abuse. Ms. Hay also proposes to remove the immunity provision in Clause 119. The reason for this suggestion is not clear. We recently amended the Police Force Act to provide that no liability shall lie personally against any enforcement officer who acts in good faith and with reasonable care in the execution of the Act or any other written law. That's Clause 119. This provision simply extends the same protection to a competent authority or authorized officer who assists a police officer in the execution of powers under the Act. So in conclusion, I have articulated the need for the bill, addressed the misconceptions that have surfaced in the past few days, and this bill is a calibrated piece of legislation that enables us to act surgically against threats that have come and continue to loom over us. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move.